Hello. Hi, y'all. Hey, Karina, it's good to see you.
Yes, thank you. I'm excited.
I'm glad to have you here and having this conversation. For those that might be joining in, feel free to drop in the chat where you are listening from. I always love to see where you're, listening from and finding out who's on the line. And this is always a interactive kind of conversation. So feel free to drop questions or comments in the chat. Feel free to share. This is a space where we can really get to build community in the online space. So, hey, Dr. Kelly. Dr. Kelly is on here. She said, "Let's go! Excited for this chat." So I am excited too. We have Scottsdale, Arizona in the house. Hey, I used to live in Scottsdale. It's beautiful. Austin, Texas. Alejandra. Hey, Alejandra. Dr. Kelly is in Seattle. So we have folks coming in from all across the nation. I am excited for those of you that might not know me. I'm Ruby Garcia. I'm a leadership and life coach. And I'm all about amplifying Latina voices and have been hosting these weekly broadcasts of different topics. So I think I need a name for the show. So if you have ideas, let me know. I feel like I need to name it at this point. But last week, Alejandra's on here. Last week we had at the Institute. We were talking about Latinas and about collaborating rather than competing with each other. And if you haven't checked it out, Alpuente put out a great article just as a follow-up of really practical steps that you can take in regards to how to actually implement that and put that in practice. But today I'm excited because we are talking about reclaiming our cultural identity. And this time Karina is on the other side of the fence because Karina is a podcaster. And so she's usually doing the one doing the interviewing, but she is multi-passionate. She's also a professional photographer, a speaker, and she is really devoted to helping people reclaim their cultural legacies and elevating her Mexican culture through photography and guided trips in Mexico. Her podcast, Elevating la Cultura, features stories from first and second generation Latinas who are working hard, pursuing their passions, and pouring their positive efforts and benefits into the next generation. She is from the Chicago area. Hey, right? Yeah. And is currently working on opening a space with her family, her husband, and her two kiddos so that they can use it for workshops, events, and to really just elevate the importance of cultural legacy. And I love that word, cultural legacy, and I want to dive into that a little later. But Karina, to get us started, can you tell me just a little bit about your cultural background and kind of what led you to this point where reclaiming your cultural identity is a topic that you're passionate about?
So I am Mexicana Americana. I have family in Mexico, but I was born here in the US in the Chicagoland area. I am the oldest of two daughters. My father immigrated from Mexico when he was young in his teens. My mother was born here, but her family is from the Texas and just over the border in Mexico area. And so I grew up here in Chicago. My father is an entrepreneur and he owned businesses in Chicago. So even though we lived in the suburbs, I was still like aware of Chicago. And that's why I ended up back here in Chicago because I love the city so much. But I grew up in the suburbs. It was a predominantly white suburb, predominantly white schools. And I continued that way through my education. And I went to a predominantly white higher education institution in Michigan. So I grew up with this knowledge of that I am Mexicana. I would go to see my family almost every year, sometimes twice a year. They would come visit in the summer and spend summers with us. My cousins would. I would see my abuela, my tias. They would come visit. But there was always this duality. And it was something that I didn't know I was being conditioned to. when I was younger. And so it really has been like a journey to get to this point now. And so the foundational years of my life, I was developing this duality where I knew I was Mexican. I knew that my family was in Mexico. I knew that we had tamales and we cooked Mexican food. But at the same time, I was taught to present myself in a certain way in my education space and in the spaces that I was in outside of my home. And so it really wasn't until adulthood and I was well into my photography career after I had kids that I realized I had gotten to this place where I did not really have a firm grasp on my cultural identity and then my cultural legacy, what I wanted to pass down to my kids, how I wanted them to be proud of their culture, not just in the home, but in their whole lives. And so it was one pivotal event where I photographed a wedding. It was on Cinco de Mayo.
So
And
listen up, folks, because this is this weekend, and I know there's going to be a lot going on, right? And so tell us, I know I've heard the story, so tell us a little more about what happened at Cinco de Mayo.
yes, this Cinco de Mayo wedding where I had my culture appropriated right in front of me. During the reception, people were wearing sombreros, taking tequila shots, passing the sombreros, dancing around them on the dance floor. And this wedding was not like Latine. So if you can imagine, they were very much appropriating my culture. And I had to smile, take pictures, and be okay with it. And it was that pivotal moment that I realized that I had assimilated into American culture so well that people felt comfortable doing this in front of me and asking me to work the event. So that was the pivotal moment that had me thinking about my cultural legacy. What do I want my children to experience? Do I want them to also create this dual identity, to be one person in the home and be in spaces where they feel like they have to change who they are to fit in? And the answer was no. I wanted to change the way that I presented and stepped into my Latinidad. And that was really the journey. This was back in 2016 that I started really being intentional about learning about my Mexican roots and really owning my Latinidad in for the goal of continuing the cultural legacy that my ancestors already started and I was just wanting to build on for the sake of future generations.
Yeah. And for those listening, I'd be really curious if any of you have kind of had that experience of feeling like there's dual identities. I know for myself, I was just telling Karina beforehand, and next week this is going to be part of the topic that we're talking about is growing up bicultural, because I grew up with an American stepdad, and so I grew up in a very white suburban conservative neighborhood. Was one of a handful of Mexicans that sat at the lunch table together. And so it's funny because I don't even like, and yes, I had my, it was, I had my white family and my Hispanic family was the way that it went. And, I knew how to act around one family versus the other. And I remember, it wasn't really until I went to community college, and it wasn't until I was in community college that I had joined one of the Latino organizations. And that was the first time that I felt like I kind of found my group, because I think they were also felt the pull in both directions as well. And so, it's kind of embarrassing to say, but like I was so disconnected from a lot of the culture and history that was the first time I had heard of like who Cesar Chavez was. Like my mom never told me about him, or I didn't know any of the, the history. And the advisor of the organization was, her family was activists. They, were migrant workers and had worked their way up in higher education and in the legal field. And, one of the brothers had even become a very well-known judge and wrote a book about his, I think it was like from the migrant fields to the to the courtroom or something like that. But I think this is an experience that there are many of us who have had, and so this can really be. I think one of the words I want to say is like confusing to identity, right? And the where do I fit in? How did this really impact your identity when you had this kind of pivotal moment? You're there, in the moment, having to take pictures. You're witnessing what's going on, and what were you thinking in that moment that really kind of lit a fire into you and made you really start to think more about your identity?
So this was in my mid 20s. And so I really call this my quarter life crisis because at that point I had started the trajectory of building a successful business. And when you pull that tiny thread, you realize that everything starts unraveling. And for me, that was my not just cultural identity, but identity as a whole, because I had come to believe that I was just like everyone else, that I had fit in, that I assimilated well, that I was, and these are the stories that I was told, that if I do XYZ, if I get good grades, get the scholarships, that I will be successful. It's that pressure of being part of that first generation kids, that it's like, okay, well, your step is to get a higher education because that is success. And for my family, that's what that looked like. And so I just followed the steps and I did all the things that I was supposed to do. I let all of those microaggressions kind of roll off my back. I ignored them, I laughed them off. And so I was in this delusion that I was just like everyone else. But
Mhm.
it was when my own culture was being made fun of in front of me that I made the realization, like, I all of these things that I did got me to this place, but why was I feeling like internally broken by this experience? And it really was when I went back and I was editing photos and I didn't want my children to see. I didn't want them to see their culture also being made fun of and questioning, like, why are they doing that? Or why is this okay? Why should we be doing this? And that really, when I looked to the future generation, I had to ask myself, how am I going to make an impact for my kids so that they can be proud and don't have to just let these comments, like, ignore the comments and ignore all the microaggressions, and get to a place where they are in a community where it might be predominantly white, it might not, but they have this disconnect, or don't have the words, just like I didn't have the words to be able to speak up and say, like, no, that is not a nice way to put it. This is my culture. This is what I'm excited about. And so it was really when I was teaching them how to be proud, I realized that I had never been taught how to really embrace and be proud of who I was in my fullness. Like, I was very okay doing that when I was in Mexico and being part of the parades on Independence Day in September, because my father was an entrepreneur, so he was very well known in the community. And I was a part of that and I loved that. But it was this duality that I realized that I had made for myself that really kind of like dug at my identity. And that really was where I started. And it was that motivation that I didn't want that for my kids that really kept me going, because it is really hard. Like I said, I call it my midlife crisis. And it is, I always say, like, do this in partnership with a community, with therapy, people you can talk to, because it is really heavy, especially if you come from predominantly white spaces and are trying to reconstruct your whole identity, but also reconstruct the community that you want to be a part of. And part of that is letting go of some people that were not on the same page as far as honoring who I was as a Mexican American. And that is it's hard. It's not easy.
Yeah, I definitely can relate to that. I had a friend, it was a high school friend that I was friends with for years, and she kept making these microaggressions. And she had moved to Arizona, and she was kind of picking up some of the rhetoric that was going on around there. But she, I heard, and I don't know if anyone else can relate who's listening, but I would often hear like, well, you're not one of those types of Mexicans. And I was like, what does that
Yes,
mean? What exactly do
exactly.
you mean by that? And
Those Mexicans, yeah.
I try to have some conversations to I guess, again, this is my early 20s, to kind of educate her. And eventually I just had to end that friendship because I felt so, disrespected. And we just could not see eye to eye. And to be honest, she still didn't understand why I was upset about some of the things that she was saying. And so that's really it. It really is very difficult because I think for some of us, we're maybe more, it could be their personality that we're a little more passive or don't like confrontation, or don't know what to say, what the right thing is to say in situations. And so that can be very internally just conflicting, I guess is the word that I want to say. So how did you go about kind of, so here you are kind of teaching your kids to be proud, right, and to embrace their Latinidad. What did that process look like for you, because
So
you were
I think,
also kind of working through it at the same time with your kids?
yes, and that is a wild ride as well. I The first thing I did was I went to Mexico. I was like, I need to have some grounding. And it didn't happen right away. So this wedding was in May at the beginning of wedding season. I finished out my year, and then I was like, I need to kind of start over in my way of thinking about photography, about how I'm presenting myself. And I was like, what better way to do that than go to Mexico by myself? And I took a workshop in Guanajuato and kind of just reconnected with photography as it related to more architecture, more lifestyle, as opposed to photographing people. And so even when I was at that workshop, I was the only, or yeah, I think I was the only Mexican that went, and there was even there a disconnect. No one spoke Spanish, so I was asked to translate a few things. I was asked like questions about Mexican history, and I was like, I'm going and taking this workshop in Mexico, and I'm still having to do education on my own my own roots
And the
as I'm learning.
facilitators were Canadian, correct?
Yes, they were not Mexican at all. So there was like a, another layer of that piece, especially when I was trying to ground myself. And so after that trip, I realized that there was a bigger disconnect with how Americans viewed Mexico and Mexican history and the reality of things. And I attribute that to that there are just holes in US education as when it comes to history and when it comes to US history and world history.
Yeah, that's probably putting it lightly.
Yes. And so, I mean, we're seeing that more in recent times. Like that is more vocal right now. So it's easy for us to see. But this was like 10 years ago when I was just learning, like, oh my gosh, I never learned about Cinco de Mayo in school. No wonder people only see what is marketed as far as understanding what Cinco de Mayo is. And so really when I came back from that trip, I was like, okay, I'm going to educate myself and I'm going to bring other people along. And so I did that through Instagram. I started by learning the recipes that I enjoyed as a kid, because at this point I had become embarrassed to even cook Mexican food, eat Mexican food, because of what it would look like. Like, oh, yes, of course you're eating Mexican food because you're Mexican. And so I had all of these conditioned ideas and thoughts and all these microaggressions that were already like in my head. And I was painting a story based on what everyone else thought about Mexicans in the US and how I should present myself in order to attain success. And so I had to unravel all of that. And so I started from square one, where I was doing research on these Mexican traditions and holidays. I was learning how to cook Mexican food and bringing my children in on that process. I would take pictures and share the recipes, as simple as they were. I would share them on my website. I would share photos, and I would be sprinkling in pieces of history and information that I was learning. So I was taking people along on this journey with me. And I started releasing collections of photos that I took in Mexico. So that way people would have access to beautiful images that are taken in Mexico, so they can feel like have that statement piece in their home and feel proud and have just like a little piece of Mexico, is what I would say. Have a little piece of Mexico in your home. And the more I shared my story and shared images and shared history, I realized that I was not alone in this, because like you, I was the only Mexicana in my suburb. So I was the only Mexican at my lunch table. And as I was sharing on a bigger platform, I realized that there were so many people who had similar stories. And so that is where the community and like my pivot of my business came from, where I started sharing my story more and people started sharing their story more. And I was like, let's start a podcast. Let's continue the momentum. Let me take people to Mexico with me so we can learn all of this together. Let me just keep building on this because it is very much needed. I think there's this group of millennials, first gen, second gen, that feel this disconnect, this dual identity, and are trying to go back and learn and really reclaim their cultural identity.
Yeah, I have a 15-year-old, and my mom is from Guadalajara, my dad is from Mexico City, um, and my ex-husband is from San Luis Potosí, and my 15-year-old is really has that desire. We went to Mexico maybe 5 years ago and spent some time there with family for a wedding, but he is now asking to go back. I said, hey, where do you want to go this year? We'll take a family vacation. Where would you like to go? And maybe depending where it is will depend on the cost and the length of the trip. And he said, I said, I can take you to Spain because I had gone there last year. He was like, I want to go to Mexico. I was like, I'm telling you, we could go anywhere and you want to go to Mexico? And I was surprised because I grew up going to Mexico every single summer and I love it. But I've seen a lot of there's still more to see. Don't get me wrong. But, I guess I was looking forward to a new place. But for him, at his age, and I think that age of this is an age where you're really trying to come into your own, and so he's even looking to connect more with the cultural part of his identity, and just learning more. So I was like, okay, well, I guess I think it looks like we're gonna go towards the later end of the year, around Dia de los Muertos, because we've not experienced that firsthand, and so we thought that would be a fun time to go as a family. But there's definitely this urge to reconnect with part of his identity, and I think even for me, so my Spanish is más o menos. I can certainly get along. You will know in a heartbeat that it is not my first language. I don't know if any of you are also in that position, and it can be an area of like sometimes I get really embarrassed about it, depending on who I'm speaking to. Kind of learning to embrace that more and just understanding all the the factors that of how I ended up not speaking Spanish as my first language. But that's definitely an area that I've looked to improve in practice, because I would like to become more proficient, even though I can I can carry a full conversation. I still get very uncomfortable if there's a lot of people watching, or, if someone wants me to translate more business, it's easier for me to articulate myself in English. So I know that's one of the ways. What are some of the other ways that, individuals can kind of start this process of reclaiming some of their identity if they feel disconnected, or, one step removed away from it? What are some of the different ways that individuals can reconnect?
I love the list of things that people can do that you posted on LinkedIn. I think everything on that list is very attainable to do. For me, I started out with making the decision and figuring out why this was important for me. And I think that it has always been the driver for me to do all these things, because it's not easy to practice Spanish. I'm not fully bilingual. I can get by, but it's hard because you're having to unlearn all of these shaming thoughts and ideas that have been put into your head about how, oh, you're not really Latino if you don't know how to speak Spanish, or how can you not know how to speak Spanish? And when you start to understand that there is history tied to perhaps you not learning how to speak Spanish, you kind of understand and have empathy for the reason that you don't know how to speak Spanish. So I'm just taking language as an example.
Yeah,
So
and that's a great example, because that can be a way that even amongst our own community, that we start to, we look at like language as a way to gatekeep,
yeah.
To really, I guess identify whether you're really, Latino enough is if you speak the language or not, right? So that's one way that can occur. But you're right, understanding the history. And I know, if any of you have read You Sound Like a White Girl, I have it right here, by Julissa Arsa. That's a great book where she talks about some of these myths about assimilation, right? And she talks about language as one of the ways that we assimilate. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, because when you understand the history that is tied, you understand that it was a form of oppression. Like, there's a generation that was taught not to speak Spanish because they had all of this negative impact on if they did speak Spanish. And like I said, like, you start pulling that thread and you unravel this whole history of knowledge and understanding to understand where you are now and how you got there. And so just being able to give yourself some grace and always going back to that motivation of why this is important. So it is hard. It is hard to learn Spanish. It's hard to practice because you have those shameful, like, oh, I should know this, or why aren't I doing this as well, as fluently as I want to. I'm having to Google how to say these. But you know what? It's going to be an asset. And my kids see me trying and speaking Spanish, which gives them motivation to try and mess up. And there's no shame in that. And so I'm just trying to build a new way forward and helping people to get rid of the shame. Like, I don't know how to cook Mexican food. And so I'm having to look on YouTube and look up recipes and just trying it. And if it doesn't come out, if I burn the frijoles the first time, I'm just going to try again. And it happens.
Hey, it's hard because you know what? I call my aunt, I call my tia or my mom. I'll be like, Mom, how do I make something? And they're like, add a little of this, add a little of that. Well, can you give me exact measurements? I don't know how much is what.
Yes. Yeah. So I think when you actually seek out those opportunities, that's where you start to see a community and you start to feel less alone. So I think, like, taking that list and picking one thing and really being intentional about diving into that into that one thing. So I have created a no pressure Spanish cafecito. I just launched it last month, where we get together for 30 minutes and hablamos en español like the whole time, and we're stumbling through it, we're looking up words, but we are keeping each other accountable. We are just putting into practice, and if you don't speak fluent, like at least you can hear and start thinking in Spanish. And so it's those things that are motivating me, and like we're motivating each other in that community. Another thing is looking up YouTube recipes or finding a class online where you can learn how to make conchas or pan dulce or arroz and frijoles, all of the basic things, so that you can start feeling like, okay, I have one thing, let me add on another. Okay, I got that thing, let me share with other people, and let me keep adding on. So it's keeping that momentum going while also being really grounded and rooted into why you're doing it, why it's important.
Yeah. Yeah. So understanding that why will help you drive the action forward. One of the things that I wanted, and I was saying, one of the things that I heard in one of your podcasts that you were talking about was also the role of therapy. And I want to bring that up because it is, May is mental health awareness month. And there is still a lot of stigma and taboo around this. I would say primarily with the older generations. I feel like this newer, younger generation is very open about therapy and will just, bring it up even casually. But tell me a little about that journey for you. And this is on her podcast, so I'm not putting her on the spot. You can check out a whole episode that Karina talks about her journey with therapy. But I want to be really I want to be really intentional with this, because people sometimes I think I'm joking, because I'll be like in spaces with Latinos and I'll be like, therapy. And they kind of laugh at first. And then they realize like, no, I'm actually very serious about it. And I know for myself, I've, done therapy over the years as I've experienced divorce, lost a brother, just different life circumstances. And for me, therapy was a game changer, especially when I found a Latina therapist. That completely changed the game for me, because I didn't have to explain a lot of some of the cultural dynamics and family dynamics that came with the culture. And so, that just saved a lot of time. Like, she got the perspective that I was coming from. And so we were able to get, into things way faster versus having to explain or someone not get it and all that. So share with us a little about, your journey with therapy and some of what you've learned.
Yeah, so it's season 5 of the podcast, where I share and dive a little deeper on my personal story. And so it's a mini season, just I believe 5 or 6 episodes. And I really go through different parts of my life and my journey that has brought me to here. And part of that is me sharing about therapy. And I grew up with the mentality of, if you are feeling down or depressed, like just work through it, like get over it, get it together, go run away to Mexico for a weekend and you'll feel better right away. And so I had that modeled to me, and I did not really believe that I was depressed. When I was feeling down, I just wasn't doing enough. And it wasn't until I shared, it was after my pregnancy, I was going in to do like a checkup, and she was asking me questions, like routine questions about my mental health. And I was answering honestly, because I thought everyone felt anxious or stressed like all the time. And she was like, this could be something more. And I was like, you mean this isn't normal? This isn't real? Like, my mind was blown when I actually shared and actually was validated by the things that I was feeling. And that overwhelm was not just a normal thing that I should be feeling all the time. And so that was the first time someone brought to my mind that I might need some outside assistance. And so my midwife said that I might have postpartum depression and that I should seek out a therapist. She also gave me some medication. And so when I talked to my family about this, they were very, they ignored it. They were like, I don't know. But it was when I talked to one family member, my aunt, and she also validated my feelings and said, you know what, you need to do what is best for you and your family. And so at that point, I made a decision like, okay, I think I'm going to try this medication. Let me also try therapy. And so, like, that was the best decision of my life at that point. This is also when I was going through my quarter life crisis. And so I really had that help to be able to move forward, to keep moving forward and pull myself out of this identity crisis. And so that was my first experience with therapy and medication. And it was really great for me to be able to change the trajectory of how I also wanted to continue my legacy as a parent. So it was during that time that I had clarity to be able to be honest with myself on how I may have been raised some certain ways and how I wanted to change that. And so during that time, I really had the clarity and the support to do the shift in my life. And even now, I did take a break from medication and therapy for a few years while I continued to transition. But I also was, I think 2 years ago, was more intentional about seeking out a Latina therapist because, like you said, there's something where we don't have to do extra work to relay what we're feeling.
Mm.
Yeah. So that was a priority to me at that time. And so I have since made sure that I have my therapist help because I am like being so vocal and personal on the podcast as I share on stages, as I share with larger audiences. And it is a lot. It's heavy work. It's a lot of emotional work. And so I knew that I wanted to have the support from a therapist to be able to continue the work that I'm doing. And also, I think you mentioned it earlier in our conversation that I am doing a lot of these shifts and generational shifts in reality. I'm doing these at the same time I'm trying to heal myself. And so I'm healing myself and my thoughts and my conditioned ideas and rewriting the narrative in my head while also trying to guide my children through that. And so that adds on this extra layer. And I think a lot of millennials can relate. A lot of people that find themselves in this space of having children, knowing they want to change the direction or the things that they had in place when they were children. And that involves doing a lot of work on ourselves and also trying to hang on to the previous generation because we don't want to lose that connection as well. So it is a lot of work that we find ourselves doing right now. And I think I can only do it with the help of my therapist. Like I've been able to really share my thoughts and have an outside perspective on how I can think about things differently and really have the accountability to put the things in practice on a weekly basis.
Yeah. And I'm really curious for you to share with our audience just a little about too, because you're also married to a non-Latino, correct?
Correct.
Right.
He is white from
Okay.
Michigan.
So, and then you went through this, like you were already married when you kind of went through this cultural identity crisis. So I'm really curious about how that impacted your relationships. Because that is, there's a whole lot of other conversations that can kind of also unravel in that. So what has that experience been as you've kind of you know, become more fully expressed in your Latinidad? And how has that impacted the relationship?
I am so thankful for the support of my husband. And, when we got married and we started working side by side, because I worked with him, we had our wedding photography business together. And it was actually at that wedding, that Cinco de Mayo wedding, where he was more offended than I was at what was going on. And I think it's because I had years and years of knowing how to disconnect and shut that part down to just let things happen and to allow microaggressions, racism just to exist around me. And that was the first time that he experienced that alongside me. And he was like shocked. He was blown away. And I was like, oh this happens. Like, it is what it is. And it really was him saying, like, I can't believe that happened. Really, that kept me thinking, like, you're right. This isn't right. What am I going to do? So it was really, thankfully, to his support and leaving space for me to share vulnerably, because I was also able to share and say, like, oh, actually, there was this comment that was made by so and so, and this is what I was thinking, and I ignored it at the time. And he was like, I can't believe that. You should have said something. And I was like, I don't have the words to say anything. And so, really, I am just so thankful that he is as supportive and aware with me on the reality of things. And so he will go on trips with my father to Mexico, just him and my father. And he has really wanted to embrace the Mexican culture, because he knows his kids are, like, he needs to set that example for his kids to embrace that as well. So he is super supportive in that. And we have real conversations about what his cultural history means, and how he is shifting the ways that he thinks for the sake of raising bicultural children. And so it is very complex. We have a lot of hard conversations together and with our kids, but I think it's those hard conversations that are really going to change the way we empower the next generation to communicate.
Yeah, definitely. I have my 10-year-old is actually, since kindergarten, he's in fourth grade now, is in a dual immersion language program. And so he knows Spanish they started 90-10, like 90% Spanish, 10% English.
Yeah.
And then I think by first or second grade, it starts going down. And then by third grade, it's a 60-40 split. But it's funny because now he knows Spanish better than I do. My mom and I used to speak Spanish in order for him not to understand what we were saying. And then at some point we realized, like, he was like, I heard that, blah, 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 and we're like, okay, I guess we can't talk. And like, it was kind of like our code before.
Yeah.
And we realized that he was able to listen and could translate. And he actually has better pronunciation than I do, and probably, can correct me on my Spanish sometimes. But what I find really interesting is, for him, he does not like to speak Spanish. I'll try speaking Spanish to him at home, and he doesn't care to do it at all. Now, I think for him, it's a little bit because I've had a lot of conversations around him about, being proud of who he is, and, that the language is part of the culture. But I think for him, it's just, even like reading, he's learning to read in English and Spanish. And so it's just, for him, I think he looks at it as like more work. I'm like, one day you're going to thank me. One day you're going to thank me. You don't realize it now, but one day you're going to thank me. But, I think it's also this feeling of like just wanting to, belong. And so belonging becomes a huge, huge piece of it, and just wanting to, to fit in. Thankfully, at his school, it's a very diverse. So that is, I think, provides him more of an environment that he can, practice and thrive in. But it is interesting to see just how, my even between my two sons, the 15-year-old is wanting to, embrace it more. And the 10-year-old is like, I don't want anything to do with this.
Yeah, I mean, with my two kids, it's the same thing. I think it's also just a season of where they are in their lives. But I try to keep keep at it, keep encouraging them, keep speaking to them in Spanish, and hopefully one day they'll appreciate it.
Yeah. Tell me more. So I know you talk a lot about cultural legacy too, which I've never really thought of that word. So the first time I had read it or heard you talk about it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I know you've kind of been touching on this as we've been talking here, but tell, if you could just share a little about what cultural legacy really means to you. And if you have any tips in terms of like, how do you create a cultural legacy?
I think a lot of times, at least I was taught to think about legacy like when I'm old. Like that's when I'll figure out my legacy, or I'm just gonna do what I gotta do and then I'll see what my legacy is when like I'm at the end of my life. But really, when I started thinking about the sacrifice that my parents made to create a different life for their kids and how I am too building upon that to create a better and different life for my kids, I see that I want to honor and appreciate and celebrate the work that my parents did. And even though I might be shifting, it's not a reflection on like, oh, they didn't do XYZ and I'm going to be upset at that. It's more like understanding that they also have a history and they're trying to build upon their roots and their like my grandparents and their grandparents. And it is really, when we look back on our history, we see that we are so connected. And when we look back even further, we realize that some of the things that have been passed down has been because of colonization and
Mhm.
this idea of erasing our culture to fit into and assimilate to the predominant colonized people that were coming into Mexico, into the US, into Latin America. And I want to do what is like, I don't want to lose that culture. And so part of that is like, I don't want to lose the language, like Spanish language. So I'm going to work hard to continue passing that down and the importance of speaking Spanish down to my kids. I don't want the like the tradition of passing down traditions and like with Dia de los Muertos or Independence Day. I don't want to lose those traditions and the things that we've done in our family, so I want to pass them down. How am I going to be intentional about doing that? I don't want to lose these family recipes just because I don't know them. And it's easy. It's easy to say like, oh, well, I don't have to speak Spanish. I don't have to do like work hard at learning these meals. I'll just go across the street if I want Mexican food. But it's that intentionality of how am I going to take the work of my parents and my ancestors, build upon that so I can continue that with future generations.
That's so good. And I'd be interested in hearing from some of the audience some of the different ways that you feel that you're, putting into action of reclaiming your Latinidad. I do think we're at interesting times right now as we, I was just thinking about this earlier, like there's so much going on in the music genre right now with Latina and Latinx artists. They're getting a lot of attention, Bad Bunny breaking charts. Becky G has been a huge advocate and speaking up on issues, impacting the Latina community. America Ferrera has always been a huge champion and has done so much work, both not only just with media, but also in the political realm. I know John Leguizamo now just came out with his, I don't know if it came out. I think maybe it just came out this week or last week, but he has a show And I just read this morning that Eva Longoria has a movie coming out as well, to really highlight some of the contributions of the Latino and Latina community. So we're in really interesting times. But if there are some of you listening, I'd love to know from you, what are the ways that you're reclaiming your Latinidad. I know, I shared some practices today on LinkedIn, just about, it could be through music, it could be through language, it could be through different spiritual practices or traditions, learning the history, doing your DNA. I found out there's even a DNA test that is specific towards Mexico, Latin America, that will actually go down to even the tribe. I think it's called Somos, if I remember correctly, that will really identify, there's different like DNA markers, so they can get even, more specific than just the 23andMe or some of the other ones. So that's something that you can do. I know, for myself, I've been really working around the language. So I've been even watching a lot of telenovelas.
Yes. That's like my go-to when I need to
My guilty pleasure.
Yes, watch some novelas in Spanish and it comes back. You get quicker.
Yeah, exactly. That is definitely my guilty pleasure. I do a lot of reading, but I do a lot of, I gotta admit, I do a lot of reading for like professional development or personal development. So at night, sometimes I just want to turn off the brain, and I love watching telenovelas because I'm like, I don't have to think as hard, and I'm practicing the language, and even hearing the different language from different regions, depending on the telenovela. Some of the words or phrases that are different is always interesting. So there's so many different ways. Erica says, I raise my daughters with stories. Storytelling is big in our family, telling them my mother's story of coming to America, the reasons why, my story of growing up as a first child in both my mother and father's side in the US, because it's their story too. Oh yeah, that's so powerful. Yeah, passing down those stories. That's such a great thing to do, and even to be able to document that so it doesn't get lost, right? Okay, Adriana says finding videos on how to learn the Zapotec language. That's awesome. Yeah, so I love that. So I know that you are, you've been taking groups to kind of get engaged and immerse themselves in the culture, really through an experiential process. Can you share a little more about that? And because I know there's it's not just like, it's not touristy, but there's a lot more deeper work that's going on. Tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, so like I said, the first thing I did after this wedding was go back to Mexico. And when I saw that there was this disconnect, even with the people that I was traveling with, I was like, I want to learn more. So the next time I come to Mexico, I'm going to take a workshop on how to make salsas. And thankfully, like Airbnb and Instagram has been the ones that have connected me with the people that I work with now. And I started learning how to make pan dulces. I took history tours, and I just started building relationships with people in Mexico and learning from them. And so after a few years, actually, I took my father with me on one of the trips, and to learn alongside him was amazing. Like, we had the best time. And still, when we travel together, we have the best time. And to see the excitement and the wonder and the joy in his eyes when he's learning these things, because like I said, he immigrated when he was young, and so he did not have that education in Mexico either. So I knew that I wanted to bring people along with me to experience this. And so I did it little by little. I would bring a friend here, I'd bring a friend there. And then I was like, let's bring a group. And so that experience was amazing. I did the first one. Well, because of the pandemic, it got pushed back a few years. But 2 years ago is when I facilitated the first trip. And I just reached out to my contacts in Mexico and scheduled like history tours, immersive experience where we're building crafts or we're learning about traditions, where we're learning how to cook and bake and really connecting and having these conversations that you and I are having right now. We're having them in real time. And then my hope is to then have people like, how are you going to take this experience back home with you and implement and continue and build upon this so that you can either feel free to, well, feel more confident to travel on your own with your own family, or be intentional about continuing this at home with your own family. So yes, my trips are a lot of fun. We eat a lot and we are really immersed in the Mexican traditions, and really have good, deep conversations the whole week.
Okay. And what has been the experience that has been most transformative to you about doing that?
I mean, I think that I have been more intentional about learning about the different regions in Mexico, because my family is from Guadalajara, so that's all I grew up knowing. Like I knew Jalisco, Guadalajara, the beach. And when I started traveling to Oaxaca, when I went to Puebla, when I went to these different states, I experienced the diversity in history and also in food. And I was like, the way that Mexico is portrayed in the US is like so simple and so small. And I want to be able to share the richness and the deep history that Mexico has. And it is very diverse. And it is not just margaritas on the beach. And I think when I realized that years ago, that was why I wanted to bring people along with me to understand and get those pieces of history that are really missing in our education here in the US.
Yeah, and I know here we're talking specifically about Mexico, but really that goes, for all of, Latin America is like there's so much diversity, right? If we're just thinking about Mexico and the diversity that lies in diversity, but yet we're still looking at things through kind of this one-dimensional lens,
Yeah.
not realizing, the different regions and the food and even the language and dialects can change, and, customs, and then thinking about, how that is among the larger Latino community, and
Mm-hmm.
all the, I think, all the backgrounds and the cultural differences, and really understanding that. Like I love, my friends range. My best friend's Puerto Rican, and so I've, really love Puerto Rican food, and, Dominican I've learned, and just, but also learning about, even some of our different experiences, but also the similarities as well. So
Yeah.
there's so much diversity, and it's important that we learn that about each other too, right?
Right. I mean, society is moving towards a more multicultural society. And I think when we start to listen to each other's stories, we see how we are connected, and we have more empathy and understanding for people's cultural legacies and their stories and their roots and their experiences. And I think it just builds a stronger foundation in our Latinidad, because we are not like just Mexican. And while I focus on Mexico and Mexican experiences and history because I am Mexican, I encourage people to do that for their own cultural roots as well.
Yeah, great. And where can people find you, Karina, if they want to learn more about like your next trip, or just get involved in some of these Spanish cafecitos, or just be part of this community? Where can they learn more?
Yes. So for my art and my trips, you can go to karinamora.com or follow me on Instagram at karinamora_prints. And to be part of this community, I have the podcast Elevating la Cultura. And so you can find that elevatinglacultura.com. That's where I post our upcoming events. And we have a private Facebook group, Elevating la Cultura Comunidad. And that's where I host these private, like Spanish cafecitos. I'll go live on there. We discuss a little bit more deep of the conversations that I have on the podcast. So you can connect with me however you want through the podcast, Elevating la Cultura. You can find me everywhere. And my personal is karinamora.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karina. So I hope that this leaves you a little more inspired to just, explore your culture, get connected to your roots, right? Learn more about your ancestry. I know that this is something that I'm even taking on. I, want to be more proficient in my Spanish. I've also found myself wanting to really connect to the land more, has also been a big practice for me personally, and just learning more about like the, like just even indigenous, practices and spiritual practices as well. So I'd love to hear from some of you. Feel free to drop me a DM or drop Karina a DM. Share with us the way that you're reclaiming your cultura. And the big takeaway here, I think, out of anything is like, you really define yourself. You get to define yourself. It's not up to others to define yourself. And I think that's an important part of this conversation is, again, there's a lot of gatekeeping in terms of like, how Latino are you really? But really that is up to you to define, and you can keep what serves you, and you can also bless and release the rest. So
Yes.
Karina, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for everyone that joined in. We will be back next week. Next week I have Maria Gamboa, who is, she has a PhD in Latin American history. And we're going to be talking about, very similar to this topic, we're going to be talking about growing up bicultural. In a conversation with her, we both have learned about each other that we both have American stepdads. And so that has also influenced the way we were raised, and that led to a whole conversation. So we are going to be talking about that more, and just kind of even continuing in this conversation about, identity and, how to really embrace your Latinidad. So I look forward to seeing everyone. Karina, thank you again. And
Thank
make sure
you.
to check Karina out at karinamora.com or her podcast, Elevating la Cultura. See, there I go with my Spanish again. See,
It's fine. It's
but
good.
thank you everyone for joining in. Have a great week.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.